Daniel 6 presents a transition of kingdoms, rulers, and administrations, yet above them all stands the unshakable kingdom of God. The chapter is not merely about surviving a lion's den. It is about the triumph of God's covenant faithfulness over the accusations of men and the collapse of earthly systems that oppose his people. Darius organized the kingdom under governors and presidents, and Daniel distinguished himself because an excellent spirit was in him. Daniel had already lived through the rise and fall of Babylon, and now another empire ruled the world. This reveals the temporary nature of earthly dominion. Kingdoms rise with power and splendor, but they eventually pass away. God alone establishes what endures forever. The jealousy of the officials toward Daniel reflects the hostility that worldly systems often have toward righteousness. They could find no corruption in him because he was faithful. Unable to accuse him concerning civil matters, they turned to matters concerning his worship of God. This reveals how opposition frequently targets faith when no legitimate charge can be brought against a person. The decree forbidding prayer for 30 days elevated the king into a position of false mediation. Instead of approaching God freely, people were commanded to approach the king alone. Daniel's refusal to obey this decree demonstrated that true authority belongs to God rather than man. He continued praying openly as he had done before, showing steadfast trust in the Lord rather than fear of earthly punishment. Daniel prayed toward Jerusalem because Jerusalem represented the covenant promises of God. Even though the people had experienced exile, God had not abandoned his purposes. The direction of Daniel's prayer pointed toward restoration and fulfillment. The officials accused Daniel before Darius, appealing to the irreversible law of the Medes and Persians. This law symbolized the rigidity and condemnation of earthly systems. Human law often traps both rulers and subjects alike. Darius himself became distressed because he realized the decree had ensnared an innocent man. Daniel being cast into the lion's den paints a picture of the righteous sufferer entrusted fully into God's hands. The stone sealed over the den with the king's signet resembled final judgment in the eyes of men. Yet God's deliverance revealed that divine mercy and power are greater than the decrees of men. During the night, Darius fasted and could not sleep. Earthly rulers possess authority, yet they cannot produce peace. The king's anxiety contrasted sharply with Daniel's rest in the den. The presence of lions could not overcome the peace that comes from confidence in God. God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths because Daniel was found innocent before him. This innocence points beyond mere personal morality and highlights the vindication God gives to those who trust him. Daniel was preserved not because of human achievement, but because of covenant faithfulness and divine favor. The deliverance of Daniel demonstrates that God rescues his people from condemnation. The lions, symbols of destruction and accusation, were powerless before the Lord's intervention. What was intended for death became a testimony to God's sovereignty. When Daniel was lifted from the den without injury, the chapter displayed the triumph of faith over accusation. The officials who conspired against him fell into the very destruction they planned for another. Evil often becomes trapped by its own schemes. Darius then issued a decree honoring the God of Daniel throughout the kingdom. The king confessed that God's kingdom would not be destroyed and his dominion would endure forever. This confession stands as the central proclamation of the chapter. Earthly empires are temporary, but God's reign cannot be shaken. The chapter ultimately points beyond Daniel himself toward a greater deliverance and a greater kingdom. The preservation of Daniel anticipated the complete triumph of God's covenant purposes. The old world of condemnation, accusation, and death would eventually give way to the everlasting reign of righteousness and peace. Daniel's experience also foreshadows the suffering and vindication of Christ. Like Daniel, Christ was falsely accused, delivered over by political authorities, sealed away, and yet vindicated by God. Through his triumph, the power of condemnation was broken, and a new covenant reality was established. The lion's den, therefore, becomes a picture of deliverance from judgment and the triumph of God's eternal kingdom over every earthly system. The chapter assures believers that no decree of man can overturn the purposes of God, and no kingdom of this world can outlast the reign of the Lord.